Generation X exists in a quiet space between louder generations. They rarely dominate trends, headlines, or online conversations. Not because they lack opinions, but because they didn't grow up in a world that rewarded constant visibility. They were raised during a period of transition marked by economic uncertainty, changing family structures, and weakening trust in institutions. Stability felt conditional, and certainty was never guaranteed. So instead of learning to react loudly, they learned to observe. Instead of expecting reassurance, they developed self-reliance. And instead of constantly expressing themselves, they learned how to stay grounded in silence. Today, that silence is often misunderstood as distance or detachment. But for Generation X, it was never absence. It was a way of adapting to a world that didn't always feel predictable. Generation X learned independence earlier than most generations, not as a personal choice, but as a response to their environment. Many grew up in households where both parents worked long hours or where family structures were already changing. Spending time alone became normal, not exceptional. Coming home to an empty house meant learning how to manage time, emotions, and small responsibilities without constant supervision. Psychologically, this created They learned how to tolerate boredom, solve problems quietly, and rely on themselves when support wasn't immediately available. This didn't remove the need for connection, but it reduced dependency on it. Over time, Generation X became comfortable functioning independently, without constant reassurance. That early conditioning shaped adults who don't panic in silence and don't equate being alone with being abandoned. Generation X developed a cautious relationship with authority. They grew up watching institutions contradict themselves, leaders lose credibility, and long-term promises quietly break. Because of that, trust was never automatic. Instead of rebelling openly or submitting completely, they learned to observe. They follow rules when necessary, but they rarely attach their identity to systems. Psychologically, this created distance rather than defiance. Authority is something to evaluate, not internalize. This mindset makes Generation X less emotionally shaken when institutions fail. They don't feel deeply betrayed because they never fully outsourced security to external structures. In a culture that expects loud loyalty or loud opposition, their quiet skepticism can seem detached. In reality, it's a form of self-protection learned early. Generation X was not raised in a culture of constant emotional expression. They didn't grow up naming every feeling or receiving continuous validation for how they felt. Emotional struggles were often handled privately, not discussed openly. As a result, many learned to process emotions internally rather than externally. They developed the ability to sit with discomfort, delay reactions, and move forward without needing immediate emotional release. This created emotional containment, not emotional absence from the outside. This can look like distance or coldness, but internally, it reflects regulation and self-control. Silence doesn't automatically feel threatening to them, and emotional intensity isn't something they seek. Their emotional style was shaped by necessity, not choice, and it still defines how they respond to stress and uncertainty today. For Generation X, work was rarely presented as a source of identity or personal fulfillment. They grew up watching job security weaken, companies restructure, and loyalty fail to offer protection. As a result, work became associated with stability, not self-definition. Psychologically, this created distance between who they are and what they do. They value competence, reliability, and consistency more than recognition or visibility. Their sense of self is not fully tied to titles or professional status. This mindset makes them resilient to change. Losing a job is difficult, but it doesn't automatically collapse their identity. In a culture where work is closely tied to personal worth, Generation X's practical approach can look disengaged. In reality, it reflects a learned separation designed to protect emotional stability. Generation X formed their sense of self before visibility became a form of currency. They didn't grow up performing for an audience or measuring value through attention. Being seen was not required to feel legitimate. Status, for them, was built through reliability and competence, not reach or exposure. Psychologically, this created a generation that doesn't feel pressure to constantly explain itself or signal relevance. Silence doesn't feel like failure, and low visibility doesn't feel like loss. In today's culture, this is often misunderstood. Quiet presence is mistaken for disengagement, and absence from trends is read as irrelevance. But for Generation X, existence was never tied to performance. They don't need to be constantly visible to feel grounded, which places them at odds with systems that reward constant display. Generation X is often described as cynical, but what they developed is closer to realism. They grew up learning that effort doesn't always lead to reward, and that systems don't always work as promised. Because of that, expectations became more controlled. Psychologically, this reduces emotional volatility. They don't expect life to be fair or outcomes to be ideal. Instead, they focus on what can be managed. This mindset helps them stay grounded when plans fail or circumstances change. They tend to avoid emotional extremes. Big optimism feels risky, and deep disappointment feels unnecessary. By keeping expectations measured, they protect themselves from constant frustration. In a culture driven by exaggerated hope and exaggerated outrage, this calm realism can seem cold. In reality, it's a coping strategy shaped by experience. In relationships, Generation X tends to value stability over intensity. They are less comfortable with emotional excess and more comfortable with consistency. Loud displays of feeling don't automatically signal depth to them, and constant reassurance isn't something they seek. Psychologically, they rely on boundaries rather than constant emotional exchange. These boundaries aren't walls, but filters. Trust is built slowly and maintained through reliability rather than words. Once trust is broken, distance often increases quietly instead of dramatically. This can make them seem distant in cultures that prioritize emotional transparency and frequent affirmation. But for Generation X, connection doesn't need constant proof. Presence, respect, and continuity matter more than performance. Their relational style reflects the same quiet realism that shaped the rest of their psychology. Generation X doesn't try to stand out, and they don't feel the need to constantly explain who they are. Their psychology was shaped by transition, uncertainty, and the need to adapt quietly rather than react loudly. They learned early that stability often comes from within, not from trends, visibility, or approval. In a culture driven by speed, performance, and constant expression, this way of functioning can seem invisible. But it isn't weakness. It reflects restraint, self-regulation, and a realistic relationship with the world. If this perspective felt familiar, you're not alone. And if you enjoy psychology-based observations like this, keep watching the channel. If you haven't yet, like the video and subscribe. It helps us continue creating thoughtful content that focuses less on trends and more on how behavior actually works.